Welcome to this explainer on a completely ordinary dirt-covered tuber that literally shaped human civilization. We're talking about the humble potato, and I promise you, by the time we're done here, you will never look at a french fry the same way again.
Think about this crazy paradox for a second. We are going to trace the potato's absolutely wild journey. How does a plant go from being a toxic, outcast weed, one that was actually banned by governments and cursed by churches as the devil's apple, to becoming an interplanetary staple? I mean, NASA is seriously looking at it as the first crop to feed astronauts on Mars. It is an epic saga of science, marketing, disaster, and sheer survival. Section 1. Taming the Toxic Tuber. Let's rewind the clock about 8,000 years to the rocky, windswept heights of what is now Peru and Bolivia. You know, that original wild potato was absolutely nothing like the golden starchy food we know today. It was tiny, maybe the size of a walnut, and it was genuinely toxic. It was packed with solanine and tomatine, compounds that could make you severely ill or even kill you. But ancient Andean farmers figured out something miraculous. Over generations of careful observation, they selectively bred those deadly toxins right out of the plant. Without ever knowing the word genetics, they slowly bred the poison out and the starch in. By the time the Inca Empire was booming in the 1400s, these farmers were cultivating over 3,000 distinct varieties, each one perfectly adapted to different mountain microclimates. And this really shows off the scientific genius of the Inca. They solved the massive problem of food storage by inventing what is arguably humanity's very first processed food, chuño. Here's how they did it. They'd leave the potatoes out to freeze solid in the bitter mountain cold overnight, let them thaw in the intense equatorial sun the next day, and then literally walk over them barefoot to squeeze out all the moisture. They just repeated this process until they had these chalky, dry blocks that weighed almost nothing. This was a total game changer. Chuño could last up to 10 years without spoiling, easily sustaining massive armies on long campaigns. The potato wasn't just a crop, it was the bedrock of an entire empire. Moving on to Section 2, Europe's devil apple. Let's fast forward and see what happened when the Spanish brought this incredible plant back to Europe around 1570. Spoiler alert, it did not go well. To understand why Europeans despise the potato so much, we have to look at the contrast here. For centuries, European civilization relied heavily on wheats and grain. These were seen as noble crops, right? They grew upwards, soaking in the bright sunlight, and bread was considered a literal gift from God. But the potato? It was terrifying to them. It was ugly, lumpy, and grew underground in the dark dirt. And to make matters worse, botanists quickly realized it belonged to the exact same botanical family as deadly nightshade, which was one of Europe's most famous poisons. So this botanical dread just spiraled into full-blown superstitious terror. People genuinely believed the potato caused this absurd list of awful things. In France, the parliament actually banned them because they thought potatoes spread leprosy. Over in Russia, the Orthodox Church branded them the devil's apple. In parts of Germany, they blamed this poor tuber for everything from flatulence to tuberculosis and even just general moral corruption. And Scotch Presbyterians, they flat out refused to eat them simply because the word potato wasn't in the Bible. For nearly 200 years, eating a potato was considered way beneath the dignity of any respectable European. Section 3. Tricking people into eating it. So the really crucial question here is, how on earth do you make an entire continent eat a crop they think is literally evil? Well, it took desperation, war, and honestly, some of the most ingenious public relations stunts in history. Leaders in Prussia and France finally started realizing the immense strategic value of the potato. You see, invading armies could easily torch fields of wheat to starve a population, but potatoes grew safely hidden underground. An enemy army could march right over a farmer's entire winter food supply and not even know they were stepping on dinner. It was the ultimate wartime survival food. To actually get people to eat them, King Frederick the Great of Prussia, and later a French pharmacist named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier, pulled off what I like to call the royal guard trick. They deliberately planted a royal potato garden in poor soil and stationed elite armed guards around the perimeter all day. The message was obvious. Whatever is buried in this dirt is so valuable, the king is guarding it with his military. Then, brilliantly, they secretly pulled the guards away at night. Local peasants, completely driven by curiosity and a bit of greed, sneaked in and stole the plants to grow for themselves. It was an absolute masterclass in reverse psychology, and it finally broke Europe's resistance. Section 4. The deadly cost of monoculture. Let's head over to Ireland in the 1800s, where we see the potato's greatest triumph set the stage for its absolute darkest catastrophe.
In Ireland, the potato was absolutely perfect for survival. Because of British penal laws and land ownership policies, Irish Catholic tenant farmers were pushed onto tiny, marginal plots of rocky soil. The potato was literally the only crop that could produce enough food to keep a family alive on just an acre or two. And because of this, it fueled a massive population boom. But there was a fatal flaw in the system. They were relying entirely on one single, genetically identical variety known as the Irish lumper. There was zero genetic diversity. Then, in 1845, a microscopic water mold called Phytophthora infestans arrived on cargo ships. Because every single potato plant in Ireland was a genetic clone, none of them had any resistance to it. The blight swept across the country, turning lush, healthy green fields into rotting, blackened mush practically overnight. Over the next 7 years, roughly 1 million Irish people tragically died of starvation and the diseases that followed in its wake. On top of that, another 1 million people were forced to emigrate, cramming onto disease-ridden vessels that became known as coffin ships. This massive exodus dramatically reshaped the demographic map of the Atlantic world. It scattered Irish culture, tight-knit communities, and deep political grievances across cities in the United States, Canada, Australia, and Britain. And we can still clearly see those effects in global politics and culture today.
Now, the severity of this natural disaster was heavily influenced by the government's response. Charles Trevelyan, the senior British Treasury official overseeing famine relief, notoriously called the famine the judgment of God on a morally inferior people. The official policy at the time was that providing too much aid would just create dependency. As a result, while people were starving to death, Ireland continued to heavily export grain, butter, and livestock to England under armed military guard. The historical record clearly shows that these specific political choices and administrative indifferences made a terrible agricultural failure catastrophically worse.
Section 5. Conquering Earth and Space. From this devastating tragedy, the world learned a very hard lesson. Agricultural survival absolutely requires genetic diversity. And this realization launched a whole new era of global scientific potato farming that changed our modern world. Instead of abandoning the crop, farmers bred the potato for resilience, and its popularity just exploded globally. Today, the potato is the fourth most important food crop on the planet. It was embraced in Russia so completely that they started calling it the second bread. And get this, today, the countries producing the most potatoes aren't even in Europe or the Americas. China and India are currently the world's top producers, using the crop to feed billions of people. Here in the United States, the scale of our potato consumption is just staggering. Every single year, the average American eats 50 pounds of frozen potatoes, which is mostly French fries, plus 30 pounds of fresh potatoes and another 17 pounds of potato chips. To put that industrial scale into perspective, McDonald's alone uses over 3 billion pounds of potatoes every single year just to make their fries. That's a lot of potatoes. But here's the wild part. Potatoes aren't just feeding the world. Their starch derivatives are quite literally holding parts of our industrial world together. Potato starch is used in manufacturing paper, textiles, and even biodegradable plastics. It's heavily used in vodka production. During World War II, when natural rubber supplies were totally cut off, chemists actually figured out how to use potato starch to create synthetic rubber for military vehicle tires. It even forms the adhesive on the back of your postage stamps.
And that brings us to the ultimate frontier. Back in 1995, aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia, the potato achieved another huge milestone. It became the first vegetable ever grown in outer space. The exact same traits that made it indispensable to the Inca 8,000 years ago in the harsh, high-altitude climate of the Andes, the fact that it grows in poor soil, stores incredibly well, needs relatively little water, and packs a massive caloric punch, make it the absolute ideal candidate for deep space missions. Which leaves us with this incredible thought to ponder. We've traced the journey of a tiny, poisonous weed from the rocky slopes of South America to the royal courts of Europe, where it was feared and despised, through a devastating famine to becoming an industrial and culinary titan. So, will this very same crop, the one that Scottish clergymen refused to eat because it wasn't in the Bible, actually be the first thing human beings cultivate and eat when we finally establish a colony on Mars? It's an amazing question, and it really shows you the true power of this unlikely hero. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.